There have been many times in my life that I've found myself lost, going in repeated circles with scarce inklings of hope that I might break free. Vicious cycles are common with everyone. We all make choices that cause problems, which then cause new problems that bring us back to the beginning. Sometimes we never leave that spot. But I wonder what it would be like to be trapped in a repetitious circle built not of my own volition. What if it was more than an amalgamation of poor judgments and personal failings, and instead was synthetic, manufactured? What if the circle trapped more than just my mind? What if it trapped my body as a whole? Of course, what I'm referring to is something like a time loop, or perhaps a spatial loop, and this is purely in the realm of science fiction. It traps a person within a set location or series of events, and never lets them leave. The idea of it is horrifying, rightly so, but pondering deeper, I wonder what would happen if that loop began to shrink. Like a knot growing ever tighter, the loop would grow smaller and smaller, devouring itself. But what happens when it can constrict no more? What of the person trapped inside it? Would the phenomenon's unfortunate victim be free? Would they stop moving, being, thinking, and experiencing altogether? Would they be aware? Maybe the loop would collapse, and the prisoner within would be freed, or maybe they'd be stuck for an infinite amount of time. It's just food for thought, really, just a rambling of mine. Still, it is nonetheless relevant to this evening's tale. So, to whoever listens to these archives, be aware that I tend to let my inner thoughts do the talking for me on occasion, even when I don't recognize how long-winded my prattling can become. Honestly, it helps pass the time and make long nights feel shorter, especially when Never mind. I'm getting carried away again, and I'd rather focus on the reason you and I are here, that being the discoveries we've made within the vault. Now, sit back and listen closely, and let me begin. The Vault of Anubis holds countless secrets, and luckily for us, I've unraveled another that once again leaves me with more questions than answers when it comes to understanding what lies beneath the ancient sands of Egypt. Forgotten Gulch, year 3913, the Third Era. His lavender skin was dry from weeks of dehydration and malnourishment, and his black eyes experienced drainage, oozing a sticky substance in line with infection. His dry mouth felt like it was bleeding with each vocalization he made. Neurothi didn't belong here. Nobody did. Yet he found himself trapped within the very ravine he swore to never enter. In the hive of Lorna, his life path was gate warden, and he protected the citizens within from trespassers of any kind. No outsider was allowed in unless invited by the Earl King, and even so, only the Fae could pass through the gates. Under no circumstances did he deviate from this rule, and never did he allow trespassers to enter. However, that didn't mean he could stop anyone from leaving. For all its secrecy, Lorna was a pleasant place for its citizens. Walls were built around the entire ravine, and were enchanted, protecting them from the toxic gases of the wastelands while soldiers worked day and night to keep the synthesis at bay. It was a thriving metropolis, the largest of its kind, and the people knew it. They savored their fortune, their magic, and their wealth, and over the hive's vast distance were layers of homes built up instead of out, all crafted from the finest stone. There were lush gardens, water purification facilities at the top levels where water poured from great heights, windmills and farms, scraggly trees, vines, and undergrowth on most portions of natural rock, and flocks of white doves that fluttered through the ravine without the slightest hint of fear. All creatures, fey or animal, lived in harmony within the hive, and fulfillment was granted to each of them. But Narathi was outside of that now. He was in the wastes. In a gulch forbidden by the Earl King and forgotten by the world, he had found himself trapped, not by the ravine walls, not by dense forest, but by a warped flow of time and space. He couldn't explain it, but leaving the gulch was impossible. He would run endlessly in one direction, only to find himself where he started. He would climb the natural walls of jagged rock, only for a fog to roll in as he discovered that he was no more than a few meters off the ground. Every trail led nowhere or in circles, and the streams flowed directly into the cliff face and vanished, sifting into the rock itself as if reality did not function the same. There was no escape, and he knew that. Everyone did, and for that reason it was forbidden, abandoned, and forgotten. Those who entered were left behind. It was his son whom he pursued into the ravine. A mere adolescent, the boy was uncontrollable, in a state of rebellion, and searching for any means of making a name for himself. Unfortunately, that led him to the Gulch, and led Narathi there in return. Just a few hours after venturing into the ravine, he located his son's body. At first, the sight was rejected. He turned his eyes away and stopped dead in its tracks. A quiver rose up from his throat, but his mind got the better of him, and he peered back at the corpse, at which point he wheezed softly, staggered forward slowly, and whimpered quietly. It couldn't have been. It just couldn't. Yet as he approached the body that lay mangled inside a cluster of thorns, Narathi did not deny the lifeless husk before him. It was his son, Jeddah. Blood was everywhere, flesh as well. That which killed him was unclear, but it appeared that some kind of animal mutilated him, only to leave him in ribbons without taking a single bite. It was torture and nothing more. For hours, Narathi wept. However, when his tears dried up, he clawed his son free of the thorns that entangled him, wrapped him in a coat, then carried him back toward Leilorna. That was when he first tasted the ravine's power, because after hours of trudging through the fog, he found himself passing the same landmarks over and over again. An identifiable stone here, a patch of scraggly roots there. He made no headway no matter how far he walked, and he eventually ceased trying altogether. Hours passed as he paced back and forth, hoping to figure it out. He must have gotten turned around somehow. That had to be it. Once again, he hoisted his son's corpse up in both arms, then hiked along the path he first came down. But of course, the trail looped in on itself. For 2 days, Narathi tried to find a way out of the gulch, out of that forgotten wasteland which no mortal was meant to tread. But his efforts brought him to the point of desperation, and he was forced to make a terrible choice. His son needed to be buried. The body was rotten and decomposing, and fluid from within it soaked the coat in which it was wrapped. He dared not remove the covering from his son's face, for he could not bear it, and upon digging a shallow grave, he lay the body down and raked dirt over it, finally putting his son to rest. That was not the burial Jeddah deserved. Back in Lorna, the deceased were burnt to ash, then smelted into fine gems that the family could pass down for generations, sometimes even hundreds of years. Jeddah, however, was planted in the ground, soon to become food for the tendrils of the synthesis which slithered underground and beneath thick underbrush. Soon, Narathi had been inside the gulch for 4 days, and though he managed to find tainted water and sour berries to eat, he could find no way out. All paths led to the beginning. All sounds echoed forever. He could not scream, run, leave, or fight. Unless there was a mysterious method of escape, he was going to die in that ravine just like his son. There was a reason that place was forbidden, and he finally understood it. Nobody belonged there. Life itself should be elsewhere, leaving that cage of rot and ruin to fade on its own. If only Jeddah had listened to the warnings, then he would still be alive. After making a fire for the 4th night in a row, Narathi set down Seiza and listened to the night as the fog swallowed him and darkness set in. In the wilderness, all manner of sounds could be heard, yet none were recognizable. There were no animal calls like owls or predators, and not a single insect buzzed or hummed. Instead, noises were more distant, and like the deep moans of a settling building or the soft whisper of a spirit. The wind hissed through the canopies of surrounding jungle, and the vines rustled like tall grass. He could feel eyes on him from somewhere in the shadows, and he expected a great beast to pounce on him at any moment. Strangely, that never happened, and it left him to wonder, what was it that killed my son? It was a question he should have asked himself earlier, because, so far, he had spent every night completely exposed, and not once did he seek shelter. If he was lucky, perhaps there was a cave nearby, or at least a natural refuge on the cliff face. If so, that would be a wise place to reside until he found a way out, assuming one existed in the first place. When morning came, Narathi awoke to a pile of ashes that sent the slightest stream of smoke into the air, trickling like a stream of water flowing upward instead of down. His eyes and throat burned, and his brain ached like it hadn't met sleep in months. The dehydration was taking its toll, as was the hunger. His life wouldn't last if the situation didn't change, and along with shelter, he needed to secure a viable source of food and water. Through the fog he stumbled, hardly able to see further than a few meters ahead, and all around him he could hear the wilderness creeping. The plants rustled, the soil shifted, the rocks whispered. In every direction was a different sound, and yet he ascended up a slender trail that guided him higher up the ravine walls. He hadn't seen it before, and as he continued walking, the path did not loop in on itself like the others, but instead guided him directly to a structure of some kind, one that led straight into the cliff face. Beneath a shelter of rock, a gaping cavern was guarded by 2 ancient statues, both of which were worn down by time. Their finer edges were rounded now, and what was once a smooth surface was now rough, chipped and covered in fungi. He couldn't determine their likeness exactly, but for some reason they each resembled an eye. Meanwhile, the cavernous opening they guarded was pitch black within, though a draft slowly wandered out to meet him. To where did it lead? Who built the statues before it? For how long had it been abandoned? The possibility of civilization in that place wasn't worth considering, but perhaps there was a spring below ground, or something, anything that could help him find a way out. With a dry throat, Narathi swallowed his fear and proceeded into the cave. Like the ravine, the subterranean passage held moisture in the air, but also a colder temperature. It didn't take long for him to evade the exterior light and find himself in darkness. But up ahead, soft and warm it appeared, was a lavender glow. It was not a plant or flame, but instead the cave's ceiling sparkled deeper in, glittering like faraway stars. The light guided him through the cavern, led him away from pitfalls and stagnant water, and revealed murals on the walls, all of which must have been ancient. "These markings are not Fey," he muttered, while brushing a hand across one wall. Whatever he had discovered, it most certainly did not originate from his people. The creatures depicted were like beasts, often quadrupedal, scaled, or covered in fur. This led him to believe they were intended symbolism rather than a display of history, and they all appeared to be walking in line toward a great, tentacled mass. Like mindless bodies of flesh and bone, they did not deviate from their course, and all the while Narathi moved deeper into the cave. He could hear echoes further in. They weren't loud or obtrusive, but they were persistent, repetitive, and patterned. They did not consist of voices, nor did they sound like inanimate objects like flowing water or rustling leaves. Something was waiting for him at the end, and he knew that if he kept walking, he'd eventually find it. In time, the tunnel shrunk in size, then grew even smaller until he was inching along sideways, squeezing through a slender crevice like a small crack between two buildings. The rock was damp, covered in moss and ill-colored fungi, yet he passed on until the cavern widened again, this time the size of a hallway. Lavender stars glimmered upon the cave ceiling, and in the distance, a pulsating glow, a quiet hum, a steady warmth. His approach was cautious, fearful. He didn't know what his eyes were seeing, but the details became clearer with each step, and the hallway ended at a chamber with a single mass within it, though its shape, texture, and obvious intelligent design left Narathi wondering how and why it was there in the first place. Shaped like a prism, the object was crafted from stone not found in the ravines of Anequia, meaning it was foreign, and on each face was an orb implanted into the object's surface. From these orbs pulsed the lavender glow that shone dimly on the surrounding walls. The entity was warm, made a barely audible humming sound, and was encased by a millennia-old tangle of roots that looked like an experiment from a sorcerer's garden. The roots spread up the walls and even to the ceiling, and as Narathi looked around, he saw no other exit. This was the end. What is this place? He wondered. How did it get here? Having lived in the finest of Anequia's hives, Narathi knew Fey technology when he saw it, and this was foreign. However, it didn't appear human, elven, or dragonish. So who created it, and why? He felt an uncanny amount of energy radiating from the object, and when he reached out to touch it, the prism of stone responded by using some unseen force, one similar to a magnetic push, to disallow his hand from reaching its surface. "It's powerful," he whispered. The gulch in which he was trapped continued to grow in mystery, to transform and evolve, to trickle new knowledge upon him almost intentionally. This was surely not the case, but still he had to wonder. Why did all other paths loop in on themselves? How come the cave actually came to an end? How significant was this discovery, and could it help him escape? Desperately he began searching the chamber for anything significant. Another mural, an ancient writing, a statue. He'd be grateful for anything that gave him a clue. When there turned out to be nothing else in the chamber, he focused his attention on the prism itself, and the roots that encased it. Markings of an unknown language covered portions of the surface, and it was tilted, as if not firmly held in place. Strangely enough, the chamber around it seemed completely natural, yet it was a perfect circle, and the floor was rounded like a crater, as if the prism had fallen from a great height. But how could that be? It was buried deep underground, and there was a cavern leading directly to it, filled with murals, and obvious signs that it was previously discovered. It wasn't long before he began to feel ill, and a pain began to fill his stomach, his chest, and the space between his eyes. An unseen force always stopped him from touching or getting too close to the prism, and without a means of examining it further, plus the added sickness, he felt as though returning later was a good idea. He still needed to find food and water that was untainted by the synthesis, after all. Before leaving the chamber, Narathi glanced back at the prism one last time, then stumbled his way back to the cavern, studying the murals more closely on his way out. Despite his efforts, they still didn't make sense to him. As he emerged from the cavern, he was surprised to see that night had fallen upon the land. He had only been inside the cave for an hour at most, and even if he was generous with the amount of time given, it should have been morning still. It was as if time had moved much faster or skipped to another point in the future altogether. His hunger and thirst were growing by the minute, while the pain he felt inside the cavern had nearly faded. That prism and all that surrounded it, he knew it had something to do with the bizarre nature of the ravine, but with such lack of knowledge, could he possibly unravel the mystery? He was just one Fae, a simple gate warden, and he was faced with an unscalable mountain. Into the night, the fog and the gulch he tread, uncertain of how to survive or if he would at all. There had to be an answer, a way out. It was too late for his son, but that didn't mean Narathi had to die there as well. However, as he walked along the trail leading downward from the cavern, he noticed that it turned into an incline. Before long he was climbing up with no signs of descending again, and with the passage of a few minutes, he found himself standing before the exact same cave as before. The two eroded statues guarded the entrance, and every stone, every patch of root or fungi that sprouted around the exterior, was in its proper place. Upon seeing this, the reality began to set in. His fate was sealed. Yes, even though he couldn't comprehend it, though he could think of no reasonable answer for his son's death, for the never-ending pathways, for the cave and its murals, for the shifts in time, and lastly, for the otherworldly object that lay hidden underground, Narathi knew at least one thing. Soon he would be a casualty of the Gulch as well, because from what he could tell, the prism was drawing him in.